We're here with playwright Benne for our show ALMA. Ben, why don't you introduce yourself to our crowd?
Totally. So my name is Benne. I go by Ben. My pronouns are he, him, his. I'm originally from Los Angeles, California. But since then I've been living a bunch of places post-undergrad, which I did in Orange County. I've been in the Pacific Northwest. I lived in the Midwest for 2 years on fellowship at the Playwright Center. And then the last 4 years I've been on the East Coast at Yale, where I did my MFA in playwriting.
Excellent.
Yeah.
So tell us a little bit about the play ALMA from your perspective.
Totally. Well, ALMA for me, in a nutshell, is really just about the relationship between an immigrant generation, a parent, and then a child who is part of the first generation growing up in the United States, and sort of their differences in understanding of the American dream and what is possible for them.
And what was your inspiration for the show?
Totally. So the inspiration for the show was that my mother came to the United States from Guatemala when she was young, and I was born here in the United States, in LA, as I mentioned, and I just noticed that she had some dreams for me, that she thought coming from a very impoverished background would be possible for me. And then in growing up and sort of like moving through the systems in the United States, I began to like bump up against some barriers where I was like, I could see that if I really pushed very, very hard, I could potentially come close to achieving what she hopes for me. But even then it felt like slightly out of reach. And even more maybe heartbreaking for her was that I realized that I didn't want the same things for myself that she wanted for me. And so I think that became what fueled the relationship that I'm writing about at the core of the story.
Well, that's really cool to know. So she wasn't on Team Playwright?
I think for her, for my mother, being an artist is maybe a really intuitive thing for her. I see a lot of creativity in her as a person, but I think that the people that she grew up around and the environment she was in, being so poor and in Guatemala, like she didn't know any artists. That wasn't a real job for anybody that she was surrounded by. So I think when she as a child is like, I'm going to be a writer and I want to tell stories professionally and I want to paint and make art, she was just sort of like, that's not a real thing. And like what you should be is a doctor, and you should be doing something that's really useful for other people and also make a lot of money doing it and be able to like provide for a family. And I was sort of like, oh, but I just love making art so much, and I feel like art is really useful, and money maybe isn't as important to me. So yeah, I think that's what we were bumping up against as I.
Alright, I see a lot of that when I watch the play.
Oh, yeah.
Alright. Well, I know this play was workshopped in Denver.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have anything you'd like to say to the folks in Denver who are taking in this show for the first or perhaps the second time?
Yeah, totally. I would say that like I myself, having gotten to see so many iterations of this play over the last, let's see, I started working on it in 2015, so many years at this point, have learned so much about the story that I'm telling, and it has evolved with every iteration that I've seen. So even if they did get to see it at the Denver Center when it was part of the New Play Summit, they would have seen it in more of a reading format, where the text was the emphasis. But for this production, it's going to be really special because they'll get to see it with the set that it was intended to be on. They'll get to see some of the additional characters, as I like to refer to them, in the play, in addition to the two humans at the core of the story, which for me are the television set and the sky, which play really prominent roles in the storytelling of this piece. So to get to see them fully rendered as characters as I intended them to be, I think will be a really exciting part of this experience.
Alright, Ben, well I know you got to see our preview last night. What would you say struck you from this particular production at Curious compared to other versions of the show you've seen?
Yeah, so the show changes depending on what type of theater it is in. So the last production that I had done of the show, it was actually in a 75-seat theater. It was a teeny tiny little black box. So it really felt like you were inside of the living room. With this production in a 177-seat house, there's a little bit more space that needs to get filled in terms of the storytelling, and also the privilege of space is that like things just get to be bigger. So like the skyline is so striking in this set and in this production, and the utilization of the way that the sky helps tell the story I thought was really beautiful. And I think in terms of performances, there's a moment of twinning where Angel, the child, tells a story, and then toward the end of the play, Alma, the mother, tells a story. And I thought that was such a beautiful relationship between the two performances, and how I saw this sort of affinity in terms of this mother-child who loved to tell stories and are really good at telling a really embellished story. So I thought that was a really beautiful gift in terms of the directing and the two performances that I saw, and that'll stay with me for sure from this production. It was just a really joyous expression of how fun it is to tell a story.
That's great. Tell us a little bit about your writing process. Like, how do you take an inspiration and what do you do? Do you sit in your room and write it, or do you hang out in a coffee shop? How do you make these things happen?
Yeah, so the process for writing a play for me is honestly like kind of different depending on what play it is. I've had like a slightly different process for each one, and each one turns into its own unique little creature. But ideally, it always begins with like something very personal that I'm still grappling with or trying to understand more deeply. And I'll take that sort of grain of like my own personal association to an idea or a theme or an image even. I tend to be a really image-driven writer as well. I'll take that sort of nugget and start to do some research around it and start to build out my understanding of that aspect that I'm still trying to understand more fully for myself. And then I'll write a first draft, and usually that'll have way too many ideas, way too many characters, just be like maximalist to the, it'll just be too much. It'll be a little overwrought. And then the task becomes like looking at that sort of first draft and sitting on it for a little bit and then being like, where's the heart of that story? And then once I locate it in that first draft, then I take that piece of the story and go so much deeper into it. And once I sort of excavate the depth of like what that story could potentially be, I write the next draft. And usually then that turns into a play somewhere down the line. But it's a long process. Usually from like inspiration to completing a first draft tends to be about a year. And then from that first draft to the second draft tends to be another year. And then inevitably, as all these voices, there'll be all these development opportunities that start to come, and the play gets developed and developed and developed until a production happens. So usually it's like a 3 to 4 year process with a lot of plays for me before from inspiration to finally like finding a realized thing is
awesome.
Somewhat complete.
And if you're listening to that, we are also doing sound check at the moment. Let's pause. So tell me a little bit about how you got the theater bug. Did you start out acting, or what is the story there?
Yeah. Okay. Well, I've always been a really like serious-minded individual. Very driven. I'm also a Capricorn, which for people who ascribe to astrology are like, oh yeah, you're a Capricorn. So I think as a child, I just like was really ambitious, and I've always loved storytelling, and writing has just always been something that I enjoyed, and my parents would take me to our public library for story time on Tuesdays, and I always wanted to sit in the front, and like you couldn't give me enough of that. I just loved storytelling. I loved being told stories. I was read to almost every single night as a child. And then I think somewhere along the way I kind of lost touch with that and forgot what I really wanted to do as an individual, and I was in high school and was just like, I'm really unhappy and I don't really feel a sense of purpose. And then I saw drama, and I went to go see a play, and I think it was probably the second play I saw in my life. I had seen one other one on a field trip in middle school, and everybody just looked like they were having so much fun, and the audience was having so much fun. It was a production of Lend Me a Tenor, which is just like a farce, and I just, for the first time, went, I think I want to do something fun. I want to like drop the like serious, having to always be pursuing something intellectual or academic, and do something for the joy of making. Again, the way that I did when I was a child. And so it started in high school. I joined theater, and then it carried over into college, and I did some acting, and then eventually found that I was really interested in the more conceptual aspect of storytelling. So I ultimately finished my degree as a director, but I had done some playwriting concurrently and had dabbled with it. And then a few years later, my father unexpectedly passed away. I was 25 at the time, and again had gone through a period where I lost my sense of purpose and was just sort of like, I don't know what I want to be doing right now. But once he was gone, I enrolled in a playwriting class. Was one of the first things that I did. And I decided that I was going to pursue it wholeheartedly. That even though I didn't really know how to be a professional playwright, that I was going to do everything within my capacity and try to find a way. And just one thing has led so beautifully to another that I find myself here almost 10 years later.
Great.
Yeah!
Plays all over the country.
Yeah, which has been such an unexpected gift. It's like such a rarity because as a playwright, it's so hard to get your play produced even once that it's like a second production feels like an unheard of, like, wow moment. And this is the 4th professional production of ALMA now in a year. And I never ever thought that that was going to be possible at any point in my career, that I haven't played the guitar that many times. So this has been really extraordinary.
Amazing. So 2 things to conclude. One, we'd like to know what's next for you, what you're working on now, and also what advice you might give to young writers or young theater artists who want to be where you are.
Totally. Okay. So for the first one, what's coming up next? I have a production happening in Minneapolis. It's a first production of a play of mine called What Washed Ashore Stray. And so I will be there for the full month, hoping to develop that production, and I will be there through opening. And then there will be a 5th production of ALMA happening at Central Square Theater in Cambridge, Massachusetts. So those are 2 things that are on the horizon playwriting-wise. And then I would say for playwrights or for theater artists who are at an early stage of career, I think a mentor is really important. I think having a real champion of your work, somebody who really understands what you're trying to achieve as an artist, feels really important. Somebody who is nurturing in that way and can offer some perspective. I think also patience is super, super important. I remember being a young artist and really wanting validation from people really instantaneously. And honestly, I'm so glad that it's taken a little while for me to like have time to develop as an artist and to have been given a lot of really crucial and important opportunities at an early stage. So I think that's also just an important piece that is out of our control usually as an artist. But one way that I found that you can put it in your control is to create that community, for me that was anchored by a mentor, but it could be other peers of yours as an artist and practitioner. Who are going to lift you up and that help you make what it is that you want to make when larger producing entities aren't ready to take a chance on you yet. And so that you are making and practicing at all times as much as you have the capacity for. Yeah, and it has made me so much more grateful once I did get some more major opportunities by producing entities, because I was like, oh, I've had to produce on my own, I've had to market on my own, I've had to like be the person wearing many hats to get the thing up on its feet, and it makes me so grateful for all the people who make that part of their professional endeavor to help support that vision from those many hats perspectives. So yeah, I would say that's what I would offer right now.
So I have to ask a quick follow-up. Who was
Sure.
your mentor?
Yeah, I've had a few.
Okay.
So I would say the big ones have been Susan Merson, who's a playwright. She was my very first playwriting teacher and a creative writer, and she was the first one who was sort of like, you're a writer, kid. Like she was the one who was like, you are a playwright. And that was the first time I heard that from anybody. And so I didn't believe her at the time. It took a few years for those words to come back in echoes. But once it did, I've been so grateful to Susan. The other mentor that I've had, Rebecca Torino Collinsworth. as someone who in Seattle began a playwrights group called Parley, and that was where I got some crucial experience, not just writing plays and getting feedback on work in terms of how it presents on the page, but actually putting it up with actors and getting to see it in real time and understanding that translation of like, I've written this thing and this is how it gets rendered in real space and dimension, the way that a play ultimately wants to be experienced, I think. And then more recently, some of my mentors at grad school have been Trav McCraney, Anne Irby, Amy Herzog, Sarah Rule, just like some wonderful playwrights, dramaturgs, and theater artists who just have been so generous with me and have really helped me understand what it is I'm trying to achieve as an artist. Not just in terms of my art making, but how the art gets made, and really understanding process and appreciation for collaborators.
Great.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for spending part of your day with us today and doing this interview. Any final words you have for the audiences here in Denver before we shut down this interview?
Oh, just that it's been a thrill to be back in this city. I'm excited for the next opportunity that I have to be here, and I'm really hoping that people will be able to see this play ALMA and share their appreciation of the artists and this amazing theater company who are producing it. And yeah, I think for me, when I think about this play, I think about my mother, and so that's one thing that I think people can really take away, regardless of how they enter the story, is gratitude for the people who nurture us and who sacrifice on our behalf and get us to where we are. And that's what this story means for me, and I'm hoping that'll ring true for others as well.
Thank you. That's a beautiful way to end. Thank you so much.
Thank you.